Her broken body was tied to a chair and carried to the stake. She could no longer walk. On July 16, 1546, Anne Askew was executed by burning in Smithfield, London. She was 25 years old. Because her joints had been dislocated under torture, she was unable to stand. Instead, she was bound upright in a wooden chair and fastened to the stake. Gunpowder packets were tied around her body to hasten death. 3 men were executed alongside her: John Lascelles, John Hadlam, and John Hemley. All were convicted of heresy. The fire was lit by official order. Askew did not recant. Witnesses reported she remained silent as flames rose around her. Eyewitnesses saw her body consumed by fire while still seated, motionless from the rack's injuries. One observer said she barely moved. Others noted that the explosion from the gunpowder made it unclear whether she had survived the flames for long. Her name was Anne Askew. She was born into a respected family in Lincolnshire. She was a Protestant in a Catholic court, and she had refused to betray anyone else. She was the only woman known to be both tortured in the Tower of London and burned at the stake during Henry VIII's reign. She didn't begin as a heretic, just a reader of scripture, and a woman who spoke. Anne Askew was born in 1521 in Lincolnshire, England. She was the daughter of Sir William Askew, a landowner and knight who served in the court of King Henry VIII. The family held wealth and influence. She was educated, unusually so for a girl of her time. She could read and write both English and Latin. Originally, her sister Martha was meant to marry Thomas Kyme, a local Catholic landowner. When Martha died, the family insisted Anne take her place. At 15, she entered a forced marriage. 2 children followed, but Askew had already begun reading the Bible, specifically William Tyndale's English translation, which was officially banned. She started quoting scripture openly, correcting priests, and rejecting the doctrine of transubstantiation. In public and at home, she contradicted church teaching, using direct citations from the Bible. Thomas Kyme expelled her from their home. She traveled to London to seek an annulment and began preaching Protestant ideas. Despite repeated warnings, she continued distributing forbidden texts and speaking in private study groups. She wore plain clothing, refused to confess to a priest, and challenged clerical authority in letters and conversation. In a different era, her knowledge might have earned her respect. In Tudor England, it earned her enemies. She attracted the attention of the authorities not just because of her beliefs, but because of her refusal to remain silent. She was not just a dissenter, she was literate, articulate, and defiant. The combination made her dangerous. Anne Askew became known in reformist circles, but also among the conservative bishops who advised King Henry VIII. Her open challenges to Catholic doctrine put her under surveillance. She was arrested twice before her final imprisonment. The charges were always the same: spreading heresy, rejecting church doctrine, and refusing to recant. Both times, she was released. Until 1546, when the Crown sought to root out remaining Protestant voices at court. But this early promise would later give way to violence and control. Anne Askew's religious formation took shape during a period of violent uncertainty in England. As a child, she lived through Henry VIII's break from the Roman Catholic Church. By the time she was a teenager, the country had swung between obedience to the Pope and loyalty to the Crown in matters of religion. Askew was exposed early to the English Bible, most likely through underground networks distributing William Tyndale's banned translations. These texts, produced illegally and often smuggled into England, were highly controversial. Simply possessing one could result in arrest. She didn't read passively. She memorized, quoted, and used scripture to challenge priests during sermons. Her knowledge of the Bible was precise. She referenced specific verses during questioning and defended herself with scriptural logic. For Anne Askew, scripture wasn't symbolic, it was legal evidence. She came under the influence of Protestant reformers in London, including those connected to the court of Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife. Parr was known for her Protestant leanings and intellectual gatherings. Though no direct meeting is recorded, Askew's language and positions reflected the theological ideas circulating in reformist circles associated with the Queen. The Protestant ideal of individual access to the Bible without priestly mediation resonated with her. She rejected the Mass, transubstantiation, and confession. She believed the bread and wine were symbolic. She stated clearly that salvation came by faith alone, not by works or sacraments. Anne Askew's thinking was shaped not by formal tutors but by texts. She wasn't trained in theology at a university. She read banned scripture and debated doctrine in private homes. Her writings show a structured understanding of Protestant theology and an unwavering commitment to it. By 1545, she had begun writing down her thoughts and transcriptions of interrogations. These texts were compiled into what became known as the Examinations of Anne Askew. The final versions were edited and published posthumously by Protestant propagandists like John Bale and John Fox. But even the unedited versions show her clarity, precision, and intellectual defiance. She was not raised to be a martyr. She was raised to be obedient, wealthy, and useful. But Scripture changed her path. Her identity shifted not gradually, but deliberately. Soon, those ideas would be put to the test not in theory, but in power. Anne Askew never held official office, never commanded troops, and never passed laws. But in Tudor England, power could take another form: the ability to speak when silence was enforced. By 1545, she had returned to London and re-entered public religious life. Her behavior was deliberate. She walked openly into churches, challenged sermons, and engaged priests in theological debate. She did not use aliases. She used her real name and quoted scripture in English, in direct violation of the Act of 6 Articles, which criminalized heretical views. She began leaving behind written material noted, letters, copies of banned tracts. In private homes, she read the Bible aloud to others. Some of these homes were linked to members of Queen Catherine Parr's inner circle, women who also leaned Protestant but avoided direct confrontation. Askew did not. Her boldness drew attention from Bishop Edmund Bonner of London and Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley. Both had been charged with suppressing Protestant activity. In March 1545, she was arrested for the first time. During interrogation, she was questioned about the sacraments. She denied transubstantiation and was released on a technicality. She returned to preaching. Her second arrest came in May 1546. This time, the intent was clear. She was brought to the Tower of London. Not only was she accused of heresy, she was suspected of being a link between Protestant dissidents and the Queen's household. The interrogation team included Wriothesley, Bonner, and Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester. All were known for strict Catholic enforcement. They sought names. Askew refused. She was placed on the rack. It was illegal to torture women under English law. The order came directly from Wriothesley and was carried out without royal warrant. As her limbs were pulled from their sockets, she did not speak. Even as her body failed, her position remained unchanged. She denied the real presence, refused to recant, and gave no names. Her writings say, "I would rather die than break my faith." Her interrogators failed to extract a confession or evidence, but her refusal made her more dangerous. Her execution was no longer a question of doctrine. It was a demonstration of control. Now in power, her enemies began turning belief into law, and law into punishment. By the spring of 1546, the political climate in England was unstable. King Henry VIII was aging, ill, and surrounded by competing factions. Reformist figures supported Queen Catherine Parr and the advancement of Protestant ideas. Conservative clergy, led by Bishop Gardiner and Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, sought to reverse those gains. Anne Askew became a pawn and a threat within this larger power struggle. Her interrogators believed she had ties to the Queen's inner circle. They wanted names. Ladies of the court suspected of heretical sympathies. Under the legal system of the time, conviction of heresy could lead not only to death, but to the exposure and punishment of entire networks. Her silence disrupted that plan. After she was racked, Askew had to be carried in a chair for further questioning. Even then, she gave no additional information. Wriothesley and Rich personally turned the rack during her torture. Rare direct involvement from officials of their rank. Their actions suggest desperation. They needed her to speak, and she would not. Unable to use confession as leverage, they turned to spectacle. On June 18, 1546, Anne Askew was formally condemned for heresy. The charge: denying transubstantiation, refusing confession, and spreading heretical texts. Her body was so damaged that she could not stand. As she awaited execution, she was kept under close guard. Her family attempted to intervene, but no pardon came. The court's silence was strategic. If she had confessed under torture, others could be implicated. But because she hadn't, her public death became the message. Meanwhile, tensions continued inside the palace. Queen Catherine herself was briefly investigated for similar beliefs. A warrant for her arrest was reportedly prepared but never carried out. Anne Askew's death may have been a warning aimed directly at the Queen's circle. The crackdown escalated. Protestant books were seized, meetings were raided, and writers were arrested. Anne Askew's refusal to recant became a focal point for both sides. Proof of heresy to some, proof of courage to others. Askew was no longer just a defendant. She had become the symbol of a religious war. She was no longer just enforcing belief. Now, that belief was being used to justify systems of punishment. Anne Askew's final weeks coincided with the height of repression under Henry VIII's heresy laws. The machinery used against her was part of a deliberate system designed to intimidate, silence, and eliminate those who challenged the king's religious authority. The Tower of London served not only as a prison, but as a controlled site of sanctioned violence. Her interrogators were not merely clergymen, they were high-ranking political officials. Thomas Wriothesley, Lord Chancellor of England, and Richard Rich, a prominent Crown prosecutor, personally turned the handles of the rack as Askew's body was stretched. She was dislocated in her shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows. Reports state she fainted from pain. This act, illegal under English law, especially for a woman, was neither spontaneous nor rogue. It was methodical. There was no legal trial prior to torture, no due process. The use of the rack was a tool of extraction, not judgment. It was used to force names from Askew, courtiers, noblewomen, anyone linked to reformist ideology. She gave none. Askew's injuries were so severe that she had to be carried to the courtroom in a chair. When sentenced, she remained motionless. The order of execution was signed and confirmed by the Privy Council. Her death was set as public demonstration to affirm orthodoxy, display royal power, and fracture Protestant resistance. On July 16, 1546, she was transported to Smithfield, London, in a wooden chair. She was chained upright to the stake while seated. Gunpowder packets were tied to her body, a common practice meant to cause a quicker death by internal explosion. 3 other condemned men were executed beside her. One was John Lascelles, known for his earlier role in exposing Queen Catherine Howard's affairs. Like Askew, he was a vocal Protestant. At the site, former Bishop Nicholas Shaxton was ordered to preach a final sermon, urging the condemned to recant. Askew interrupted him, stating that he had falsely preached and not according to the text. She did not renounce her views. As the flames rose, eyewitnesses noted her stillness. She could not move. The explosion from the gunpowder obscured the final moments. Her remains were not buried. There was no grave marker. The system that killed her was not accidental. It was structured, endorsed, and deliberate. Her torture had failed to yield names. Her death became the final act of coercion. Even individuals close to Anne Askew, those suspected of sympathizing, were targeted by these systems. Anne Askew's defiance did not exist in isolation. It forced a reaction not just from the state, but from those around her, family, friends, and allies, many of whom either turned away or were silenced by fear. Her marriage had collapsed years earlier. Thomas Kyme, her husband, expelled her from their home when she refused to renounce Protestant beliefs. By the time of her second arrest, he had officially disowned her. There is no record of him intervening during her trial or attempting to prevent her execution. Askew's family was divided. Her father, Sir William Askew, remained loyal to the crown and avoided public confrontation. Two of her brothers reportedly attempted to advocate for her release, but failed. Under the political tension of the time, any appearance of sympathy for a condemned heretic risked investigation. Even kinship did not override the fear of association. Within the Protestant movement, some allies grew cautious. Names she once spoke with freely were now omitted from her writings. In her recorded examinations, she is careful, sometimes evasive. She withholds details. This was not indecision, it was protection. The government had turned her into bait. Anyone she named could be arrested. She did not comply. As suspicion spread, Queen Catherine Parr herself was caught in the widening net. Documents suggest that a warrant for her arrest was prepared during the summer of 1546. The Queen had openly discussed scripture with her ladies-in-waiting and was known to hold reformist views. Anne Askew's connection to these circles intensified the court's paranoia. The Queen survived only by publicly submitting to the King's authority and distancing herself from theological disputes. Among Askew's interrogators, paranoia took a different form. Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, pushed hard for Askew's execution, but also began watching his own allies. Wriothesley and Rich grew more aggressive in rooting out suspected heretics, not just to suppress dissent, but to prove their loyalty. Anne Askew had become a fracture line, splitting households, alliances, and factions. Every conversation became suspect. Every silence carried risk. She wrote little of personal emotion, but her actions reveal the consequences of isolation. No appeals were made on her behalf in court. No public letters of support were read. In her final days, she named no collaborators, received no visitors, and asked for no pardons. One betrayal, then another colder than the last. Anne Askew's final physical condition was the direct result of intentional harm. Her decline was not gradual. It was induced, accelerated, and then displayed. The rack, used in the Tower of London, was a horizontal frame with rollers at either end. By turning the rollers, interrogators could stretch the body, dislocating shoulders, elbows, knees, and hips. Anne Askew was subjected to this procedure under the direct supervision of Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Richard Rich. Contemporaneous accounts describe how she fainted during the ordeal. Her joints were pulled apart. Her body was left limp and partially paralyzed. She could no longer walk or lift her arms. After the racking, she was laid on the stone floor of her cell. No physician was provided. No official report was filed. She was left untreated. By the time of her trial, she had to be carried into the courtroom. Witnesses described her as visibly broken, unable to sit upright without support. She did not cry. She did not speak out of turn. When asked to recant, she answered with scripture. In prison, she wrote brief, controlled reflections. There is no record of hallucinations or incoherence. She remained lucid, but her writings grew shorter and more clipped. She avoided names and repeated phrases from earlier examinations. These repetitions suggest either strategic editing or mental exhaustion. She described herself as myself Anne Askew, that neither desire death nor yet fear his might. The line is precise, showing no willingness to martyr herself, but also no intention of backing down. Her food intake during these final weeks is unclear. There is no record of medical care. It is likely she lived with untreated dislocations, muscle tearing, and severe bruising. There is no indication of infection, but full mobility never returned. Mentally, she showed no signs of delusion. Her defiance remained intact, but her physical condition required her to be transported to Smithfield in a chair and bound to the stake while seated. She could not stand, she could not flee, she could barely be positioned. Observers remarked on her stillness. Some thought it was resolve. Others understood the truth. She was too damaged to move. Despite worsening health, Anne Askew retained control over key decisions. She chose not to recant, she chose not to name others, She chose not to plead for mercy. Each new pain echoed a past cruelty. Anne Askew had no formal deathbed. She spent her final days in confinement, immobilized and under guard. Her body, ravaged by torture, could not support itself. There is no record of her receiving visits from family or friends. Final words, if spoken privately, were not preserved. Her last recorded statements came during public proceedings and in written responses smuggled out of prison. These focused on two things: refusal to recant and rejection of the doctrine of transubstantiation. She did not express fear of death. She did not call for vengeance or forgiveness. Her obsession was doctrinal precision. She restated plainly that the bread and wine of the Mass were not the literal body and blood of Christ. She cited Scripture, not emotion. When offered the chance to recant, she declined. Her recorded words remain centered on biblical authority, not suffering, not justice. On the morning of July 16, 1546, she was taken from Newgate Prison to Smithfield. She was carried by cart, seated in a wooden chair due to her physical condition. 3 Protestant men were executed beside her: John Lascelles, John Hadlam, and John Hemley. As she was bound to the stake, Bishop Nicholas Shaxton was ordered to preach a sermon urging the condemned to submit to the church. Anne Askew interrupted him. From her chair, she stated that his words were not according to the text of Scripture. It was her final public statement. Gunpowder packets had been tied around her body. These were often used to hasten death by explosion. When the fire was lit, she made no visible movement. Whether she died from the fire or the explosion remains uncertain. Eyewitnesses disagreed on the moment of death. What is certain is that she did not scream, did not collapse, and did not speak again. She left no will. Her writings, the examinations, were compiled and later edited by Protestant publishers. These texts preserved her beliefs, but also shaped her legacy. Anne Askew died on July 16, 1546. Power was immediately contested. Anne Askew's execution was intended as a warning. It was designed to demonstrate the state's resolve against heresy and silence dissent in the court of Henry VIII. But the political gains were short-lived. Within a year, Henry VIII was dead. The throne passed to his son, Edward VI, and with him came a sudden shift in religious policy. Edward's regents were strongly Protestant, the same doctrines that Anne Askew had defended: justification by faith alone, symbolic communion, access to the Bible in English, were now state policy. Many of the men responsible for Askew's death lost influence or were removed. Bishop Stephen Gardiner was imprisoned in the Tower under Edward's rule. Lord Chancellor Wriothesley lost his title. Richard Rich retained power for a time, but his reputation as a torturer followed him. The conservative faction that had tried to root out reformers was dismantled piece by piece. Queen Catherine Parr, once under suspicion herself, now openly supported Protestant reforms without interference. Askew's name, previously erased from official records, began to circulate again, this time in Protestant publications. Her written examinations, smuggled from prison and edited by John Bale and later John Fox, became foundational texts for English Protestant identity. She was portrayed not just as a victim, but as a theological authority who had stood her ground under direct questioning and physical torture. The spectacle of her burning, intended to terrify, ended up galvanizing the reformist movement. Rather than erase dissent, her death gave it a name, a voice, and a record. The machinery that had been used to destroy her, interrogation, surveillance, torture, began to fracture. Those systems had depended on secrecy, silence, and fear. Anne Askew had disrupted all three. The collapse of the Conservative plan was not immediate, but it was irreversible. The old order had tried to make an example of her. Instead, they created a martyr. The historical record of Anne Askew began to evolve immediately. Anne Askew's story has been retold, revised, and reframed repeatedly over the centuries, first by religious propagandists, later by historians, feminists, and political scholars. Her legacy has never been settled. In the 16th century, John Bale and John Foxe published her examinations as part of a broader Protestant narrative. To them, she was a model of pure faith, a woman who resisted Rome, defied tyranny, and died for scriptural truth. Foxe's Book of Martyrs made her one of the central female figures of the English Reformation. He emphasized her courage, quoted her speeches, and framed her death as both moral and political victory. Modern scholars have taken a more critical approach. Some highlight how her examinations were edited after her death, shaped to suit Protestant goals. Foxe's editions may have altered her tone, inserted emphasis, or suppressed ambiguity. Her actual voice, though preserved in part, remains filtered through male editors. Other historians focus on gender. Anne Askew's literacy, theological clarity, and refusal to submit stood in sharp contrast to Tudor expectations of female obedience. Her torture on the rack, a method rarely used on women, is often cited as evidence of how deeply she disrupted patriarchal norms. Some scholars call her the first English woman to publish theological arguments under her own name. There is also debate over her relationship to political factions. Some argue she was merely a victim of circumstance, while others suggest she knew exactly how dangerous her actions were, choosing confrontation rather than silence. Her calm under pressure, her legalistic language, and her refusal to implicate others suggest strategic control. Medical historians have studied her physical condition in detail, comparing descriptions of her injuries with known effects of racking. The conclusion: her spine, joints, and limbs were likely permanently damaged. Her motionless execution posture was not symbolicit, was clinical reality. Across interpretations, one constant remains. Anne Askew refused to be silent. Whether as a martyr, a rebel, or a theologian, she is remembered for maintaining intellectual and moral clarity under extreme coercion. Modern historians continue to debate the long-term effects of Anne Askew's death and the systems that demanded it. Anne Askew's execution did not end with her death. It marked a turning point in the relationship between belief and authority in Tudor England. Her case showed how the machinery of religious control, doctrine, law, torture, execution, could be directed at a single body with surgical precision, and still fail. Her refusal to recant under torture, her silence in the face of threats, and her citation of scripture in place of apology created a template for later resistance. Askew demonstrated that ideological dissent did not require political office, armed force, or popular support. It required literacy, conviction, and the refusal to comply. The systems used to destroy her, interrogation by bishops, the secret use of torture, the public burning, were soon scrutinized, dismantled, or repurposed. After her death, public appetite for heresy executions declined sharply under Protestant monarchs. The legitimacy of such violence began to erode. Her published examinations became proof that language itself could be a weapon, not just speech, but structured theological argument. Her clear rejection of church doctrine, delivered through controlled logic and biblical citation, challenged not only the power of men like Gardiner and Wriothesley, but the foundations of state religion. Anne Askew's story remains in legal records, in Protestant hagiography, in court transcripts, and in Tudor archives. But it also endures in how England came to define religious freedom not as agreement, but as the right to dissent without mutilation or death. She left behind no heir, no monument, and no grave. But her death forced the state to reckon with the cost of making examples. It showed that violence did not erase belief, it amplified it. Anne Askew's memory now belongs to no single cause. She has been cited by Reformation historians, early feminists, human rights advocates, and scholars of state power. Her name resurfaces wherever the tools of order confront the limits of obedience. She was burned alive for refusing to recant, and for speaking clearly when silence was safer.